let's get started with this webinar to present the report from the German Council of Economic Experts. I am Marrawan. I am a professor at Northwestern, researcher at the Barcelona School of Economics, and vice president of climate here at CEPR. So today we are very lucky to have two experts that will first present the report, and then next we'll discuss its implications and some further thoughts on the situation. As you are all aware of, we are in the context of a great energy crisis. And not surprisingly, the report of the German Council of Economic Experts has a lot of focus on the implications of this energy crisis on the various aspects of our economy. Just yesterday, the EIA released a report that was presented together with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, on how to avoid gas shortages in Europe. So these are heavy times in which we're discussing things that many of us, I believe, were not expecting to discuss in the near future. Today's discussion will center around energy, although the report is more general, as you can imagine. So it's been more than a year now, I would say a year and several months, that energy prices are extremely high. And when it comes to us economists, this has changed our perspective and focus in many ways. So energy prices, we are discovering, are such an essential input that are affecting all of our economic analysis. Obviously, it has had huge impacts on monetary policy and the role of central banks, because inflation, again, as an essential inelastic input, has put a lot of upward pressure on prices and inflation. It has affected how we think about energy policy, certainly, but also industrial policy more broadly. We have seen also discussions surrounding trade, and we have seen a new appetite, for example, for domestic quotas that we might have seen in the IRA that has been passed in the United States. It obviously has also had enormous inequity and distributional consequences on different households and their different vulnerabilities. And it also has been a test on the cohesion in the union, for example, with respect to how to intervene a market that at the moment and under these grave circumstances of extremely high prices and extreme uncertainty of the availability of supply, different governments have thought differently on how to intervene markets, how to essentially subsidize energy, to which sectors to subsidize energy, how to then recover some of those subsidies. It's really kind of uncharted territory that for many years we had not been talking about words like price controls or rationing or shortages, as I was saying before. And we do need all the economic expertise and more to basically focus on these key issues, like how can we design these policies better? How can we come up with a package that will mitigate some of these impacts of this great crisis? Some of the impacts, by the way, which are inevitable because the prices are really very high and there's a limit to what can be done here. So today we will talk obviously about the German report, but we will also speak to some of these broader issues. How do we think about policy in the context of this great crisis? And as you may know, there have been already many discussions, although obviously there are more discussions than action because it's very hard to reach agreements. We have seen many discussions on, for example, how to cap the price of natural gas. But obviously the natural question then is, well, if you press the natural gas price, what are you gonna do if there is not enough natural gas? Something that, for example, was part of the report yesterday from the EIA report. So I hope that we will get to touch on some of these issues. I am personally very interested, and I think we all are from a more general economics point of view. To do that, we are very lucky to have Niklas Garner, who will present the report. He is Secretary General of the German Council of Economic Experts, and he joined the GCE as an economist in April of 2019. So I understand you have been very busy since you joined. first with COVID and now with the energy crisis, and became Deputy Secretary General in April of 2021. He's a PhD at the University of Mannheim, and he has also spent some time at Yale University in New Haven. So this is for Niklas. After Niklas, we will have a discussion by Christian Keller. Christian Keller is a managing director and head of economic research at Barclays. He's leading a global team covering both developed and emerging markets. And Mr. Keller is based in London and joined Barclays in 2007 from the IMF. It seems like Mr. Keller also joined Barclays at an interesting time. So all of you have had very rushed experiences, it seems, as you join new institutions. So with his expertise is extremely wide, and he also has previous expertise at the IMF. So we look very much forward to hearing your thoughts, Christian, on the report that Niklas will present. By the way, Mr. Keller graduated with a PhD in economics from Köln and was also an undergraduate and master's student at Köln and HEC Paris. So this is on my end for introductions. Now I will leave the floor to Niklas, who will present the report. After the report, Christian will share his thoughts on the report, as well on his general thoughts on how to face the economic crisis that we are facing. And then we will open the floor for some of your questions. If you have questions as we move along, feel free to put them on the Q&A tab that you can see below. And then again, we will leave them for the end. We will have about 15 minutes for discussion. So Niklas, thank you again for being here and for presenting the insights from the German Council. We look forward to hearing what your findings are.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. I hope you hear me and you see my slides. Okay, so yeah, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the big interest in our annual report. I think I have roughly 20 minutes, and it's quite hard to put this report of 450 pages into 20 minutes, but I'm trying my best. Yeah, so I think you already mentioned the big topics this year, and those big topics are also in the title of this year's report, which is titled "Managing the Energy Crisis in Solidarity: Shaping the New Reality." And what do we mean by managing the energy crisis in solidarity? We mean in solidarity within Germany. So thinking about the distribution of the burdens of the energy crisis and high inflation, but also in solidarity within Europe. So basically having in mind that only Europe as a whole and the European member states as a whole can address the energy crisis, and individual states shouldn't go out on their own and basically inflict negative externalities on other countries. And then shaping the new reality and speaks a bit towards basically the changed geopolitical landscape that has changed on the one hand with the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, but also before that already with increasingly geopolitical and geostrategic interests basically influencing economic and trade policy. And those are the two big topics of this year's report. Overall, the report is divided into 7 chapters. The first 3 chapters are more on the short-term issues on the economic outlook, high inflation, and German fiscal policy in response to the energy crisis. And then we have chapters 4 to 7, which are more of a medium-term nature. And I think that's also a very important message that, yes, currently the energy crisis is in all of our minds and also in the minds of politicians and those who make economic policy. But we shouldn't let our sights or let the medium-term challenges out of our sight. So actually, overall, these medium-term challenges take a much larger part of our report. And I speak to a couple of them today. So, but let me start with our economic outlook, always the shortest term in nature, basically in the report. And when we think about our economic outlook, we have 3 main drivers this year. So first of all, obviously the energy crisis. that affects both industry and households. Then in general, the high inflationary environment, where we have seen already high and increasing inflation rates before the energy crisis. And then in particular for Germany, very important, the external economic environment. Just to remind you, Germany, for the size of its economy, is extremely integrated into global value chains. So the external economic environment is always a big factor for the German outlook. When you look at the current situation, we have seen a substantial tightening of energy supplies and high energy prices, in particular in Europe, but also in Asia. And these high energy prices weigh on industrial production and on households, because they basically reduce the purchasing power of households. And that comes together with the highest inflation rates in Germany since the 1950s. So in October, we had inflation rates of 10.4% in Germany, something that we have not seen since the very early 1950s, basically the recovery of Germany after the Second World War. And at the same time, we have seen substantial monetary tightening almost all across the world. And on the one hand side, high inflation also reduces the purchasing power of households, and then monetary tightening reduces demand for investment and for durable consumption. And then on the external economic environment, we've seen a global slowdown, which puts pressure on the German outlook. But on the plus side, a partial recovery of supply chains that comes together with still a high order backlog in the German economy and might be some sort of supporting factor going forward. Now, when we look at the next year, what do we assume for our outlook? And that basically also informs the numbers that come out of our forecast. We expect sustained high energy prices, in particular high electricity and high natural gas prices, but we don't expect a physical gas shortage in this winter. For next winter, we are less sure, but our outlook only goes until the end of next year. So there we expect basic prices to be the main signal of scarcity, and these high prices continuously weighing on industrial production, in particular in the energy intensive sectors, and also still pushing inflation upwards. For the inflationary environment, we still expect high inflation rates, but we also expect a further tightening of the central bank, which will further weigh on the investment demand. On the plus side, we expect that a reduction of the savings rate of households might to some extent dampen the loss of purchasing power from high inflation, and thus also somehow slightly support the outlook. And for the external economic environment, we further expect weak exports. Our export indicator for the next year is substantially below the levels that we have seen in the past years, in particular between 2010 and 2020. But on the plus side, we expect a further easing of supply chain stress and thus some support on the industry side. What are the risks that are not in our report but are mainly to the downside? For the energy crisis, the main risk is a gas shortage. We don't expect one because we have seen substantial savings. We've seen substantial improvement in the infrastructure for LNG imports. But a gas shortage is still a risk, in particular for next winter, if savings are worse than we expect at the moment, or if the winter gets colder than on average. Then for the inflationary environment, I think the main risk is the dampening of inflation expectations. And that's also the main reason why the European Central Bank, in our view, should continue with its tightening cycle. And there are some financial market risks, in particular. There are some risks also in the real estate sector. And then for the external economic environment, the big risk for Germany is still no COVID in China, which might have implications for further supply chain stress and downturn in the US, somehow a bit too much tightening in the United States. So those are the main risks. Now, what does it mean for our outlook in numbers? When we look at the next year, we expect a slight decrease in GDP by 0.2% in 2023. And that at the first moment might not seem too strong, but I think you have to view this from the situation in which the German economy still is. And it's an economy that's still in the recovery phase from the COVID crisis. So we have just reached the pre-COVID levels this summer. And we originally had expected much stronger growth. So really the impact of the energy crisis on the German economy can be mostly seen from the downward revisions that we had in the spring for this year's outlook compared to last fall, and in this fall for next year's outlook compared to the spring. And in particular for next year, we have a downward revision of almost 4 percentage points, which is a substantial downward revision, and which illustrates this substantial blow to the German economy from the energy crisis. Now, when we look at inflation, as I said, we have seen record numbers in October, and for the next year we still expect really high inflation, even though we already take into account the gas price break in Germany, which should reduce energy price inflation or the contribution of energy prices to headline inflation by between 1 and 2 percentage points. So without the gas price break, we would be more in the ballpark of 9% inflation in 2023. And I think what's notable is that inflation next year is mostly driven, especially at the end of next year, by core inflation. So really the energy prices passing through into goods and services prices. Now that's it for the outlook. Now I want to take a bit deeper look into the current economic policy issues. And in the report, we identify 5 big challenges for Germany and also for the wider European economy. First, the short-run challenge of the energy crisis and high inflation. Then the challenge of ensuring a stable economic and monetary union, in particular in view of the increasing debt levels from COVID and also from the energy crisis, basically from the fiscal response to COVID and the energy crisis. Then structural change in manufacturing as a medium-term response to the energy crisis, and high energy prices that we expect to remain there basically until the end of this decade. Then ensuring a skilled workforce in view of demographic and structural change. And then as a last point, import dependencies and geopolitical tensions. And I'll focus on the three issues that have red lines around them for the next 10 minutes. So when we look at the energy crisis and high inflation, I think the diagnosis is relatively clear. We have seen energy prices increasing to levels that we have not seen in the past. So in particular, when we look at natural gas prices that have increased roughly tenfold in Europe in the past year, and are now at a level that is roughly 6 times, 7 times higher than the average between 2015 and 2019. And these high natural gas prices by now are also reflected in substantially higher energy prices, just due to the way the electricity prices, just due to the way the electricity market works. And we expect for the future, and that's what you see basically in the dashed lines here, substantially elevated natural gas and also substantially elevated electricity prices in Europe. And in particular, what's striking is the huge difference and the huge asymmetry between Europe, Asia, and the United States, which poses challenges to European competitiveness, in particular for energy-intensive industries. But I think what's important is this point that it's not only energy prices, basically what the whole basically inflationary pressure has broadened since since mid-2021. When we look at different core inflation measures, those have also reached historical heights in the past year, and that's basically the output side. So or the outcome side of high inflation. But also when we look at what causes these high inflation rates in Europe, we see that it's not only energy prices, but it's also other shocks that have basically resulted in these high inflation rates. And that's what we do in one analysis in the report. We basically decompose the drivers of the high inflation rates in Europe into the different sources using a structural vector autoregression. And when we do this decomposition, we see, yes, what's very different than in the past is that we have this energy supply shock that drives the high inflation rates in 2022. That's the orange bar. But it's also the recovery from the COVID shock and the differential recovery of supply and demand that is causing the high inflation rates at the moment. And that is basically also a call for the ECB to continue its tightening cycle to really bring down inflation and towards its medium-term goal. Because what I think, or what we think, the ECB has to do is really to prevent the anchoring of inflation expectations. And what we've seen over the past 2 years is a gradual increase in long-term, in particular long-term inflation expectations that have moved upwards. So if we look at 2020, most of professional forecasters expect inflation rates in 5 years of slightly below 2%. And basically nobody expected inflation rates above 2%. But when we compare this to the survey in the latest survey in 2022 Q4, we see that still most forecasters expect inflation around 2% in 5 years. So that inflation expectations are still anchored at 2%, but an increasing number of people, of professional forecasters actually, expect inflation rates of more than 2.5% in 5 years. And it's exactly this mass of, by now, roughly 15% of forecasters expecting substantially elevated inflation rates that we think has to be kept in check, and which basically has to be reduced through decisive monetary action. And that's also part of limiting price increases overall. And the idea is we have to limit price increases overall in order to reduce also the pressure for fiscal policy to somehow alleviate the burden from high inflation. Now, one part is monetary policy. The other part is definitely energy policy. And in the short run, this means, on the one hand, basically building up the infrastructure to ensure supplies with LNG. But on the other hand, it's also basically increasing energy supply from other sources than natural gas, in particular to bring down electricity prices. So in the short run, it's the infrastructure for LNG imports, it's energy savings to bring down energy prices, and also expansion of energy supply. In particular, when we look at Germany, the reactivation of coal, at least in the short run, and the prolongation of nuclear to bring down electricity prices and to reduce the demand for natural gas. And I think an important point here is that at the moment we are focusing a lot on natural gas prices, but in particular, when you look at industry, yes, natural gas is important, but electricity is much more important. So we have done an analysis at the firm level for Germany, where we basically show, okay, electricity in most industries is the most important source of energy for production. So really limiting electricity price increases is the key for competitiveness of German and European industry. So I've talked about the short run. When we look at the medium run, I think an important lever is to expand renewables. And when you look at the plans of the German government, the expansion plans are quite ambitious. The expansion plans of the German government mean a fourfold increase in the speed at which renewables are built up. And in order to achieve this goal, a number of legal changes have to be made, in particular with respect to the eligible areas for renewables. There, the German government has already taken some steps, and also, and that's a big hurdle still in Germany, accelerated permitting for actually building out renewables. And those are two areas where we make some suggestions. I think in the Q&A we can dig a bit deeper. Now, if this succeeds, if we succeed in somehow limiting the price increases, we still have, I mean, we won't be able to limit all the price increases. So there still will be substantial burden for the households and also for industry. But when we focus a bit more on households and we focus on what we have seen in the past year, we see that this burden is very unevenly distributed across the income distribution. So it's not only unevenly distributed across the income distribution, but also depending on which heating source you use, depending on whether you live in a city or in the countryside. But here we focus on the different income deciles. And what you see is, on the one hand, these different income deciles, just because they have different consumption baskets, have different inflation rates. but these are shown in the light blue. But when you but the inflation rates, the individual inflation rates only tell half of the story, because different income deciles use different share of their income actually to fund their consumption. And when you take that also into account, so take into account the consumption share of income, then actually you see that the inflation burden is substantially more unevenly distributed, with the burden at the lowest income decile being roughly twice as high as the burden at the highest income decile. And that's the reason why we think that fiscal policy should really, the cushioning of the economic burden through fiscal policy should really be targeted more towards the lower income deciles. What we've seen in Germany so far is relatively broad measures. I think most by now have heard of the 200 billion euro rescue package that has been decided in September. But even before that, we already had substantial measures that were relatively broad in nature. And we acknowledge that if you want to have short-run measures that are effective in the short run, it's very hard to get them targeted on the expenditure side, right? Because basically the utility companies, they don't know the income of people, and you cannot really create targeted measures at least at the moment in Germany. That's not possible. So what we say is that, well, even if current support is not well targeted, and even if at the moment we don't have a targeted support instrument, an instrument that should be developed fast, we have options on the income, on the tax side, to increase basically the precision of the overall package. And there we have some suggestions on basically postponing the elimination of bracket treat for 1 year, or to introduce a temporarily limited surcharge on the tax rate for higher incomes, to basically balance the whole package of support and taxes. Now, to finish, let me quickly go into the more medium-term implication of the energy crisis for industry. So in our view, and that's backed by analysis that we did at the firm level, we do not really expect widespread deindustrialization in Germany. And let me make 2 points here. So first of all, yes, some firms and some products might not be profitable anymore in Germany with the higher energy prices. But overall, there's substantial heterogeneity within industry. And that's not only across different industries, but also within relatively narrow industries, firms have substantial heterogeneity of their energy intensity. And it's really only the most energy intensive products, only the most energy intensive firms that are, in our view, really in danger. And even those are only endangered if they produce products that are relatively easily substituted by imports. And on the one hand, it's good if some of the gas intensive products are easily substitutable by imports, because then we can reduce production without having further negative consequences further down in the supply chain. And that's already what we've seen in Germany this year, with production in energy intensive industries going down a bit, but overall industrial production remaining relatively flat. So the easily substitutable products have already to some extent been substituted, and the rest can be still produced. And as I said, it's only a small part of overall industry that's really very energy intensive and can be easily substituted. So that's one reason why we don't expect widespread deindustrialization. On the other hand, we have seen over the past 25 years, with already high energy prices, that industry has become substantially more energy efficient. And that's not driven by energy intensive industries going somewhere else. So basically that would be the orange line on the right-hand side. That's basically the decline in energy intensity through a structural change. So through a change in the industry structure, but it's really mostly a decrease in energy intensity due to increased energy efficiency within industries. And that also gives us a positive outlook for the future, that really efficiency increases could help cushion the blow from the energy crisis. I would have one more slide on labor migration, but maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A, because I think I'm at slightly over 20 minutes, and then I'd leave it.
I'm happy to lend you a minute. I think actually labor migration is fascinating. I mean, if we guarantee that we get to in the Q&A, go for it, Nicholas.
Okay, yeah, okay, perfect. Thanks for the additional minutes. As I said, 20 minutes for a 450-page report is quite short. Yeah, so I want to go into one more issue that I think is really important for Germany, but is actually also really important for the European Union as a whole. And that's basically demographic change and demographic aging in particular, and the impact it has on labor supply in Europe. In Germany, we are now basically at an inflection point where the baby boomer generations are now going into retirement. And basically, when you look at the left-hand side, without any, basically in the reference scenario, that's the light blue line, that's with 100,000 persons per year net immigration, with rising labor force participation rates of older people and of women, we still would expect a decline in the labor force in Germany over the next 40 years, and a substantial decline. So basically, the labor force would shrink by roughly 20% by 2060, and already by 2035, 2040, the labor force, or the potential labor force, would shrink by 10%. If we cannot increase immigration. And so this is a study from the Institute of Employment Research that shows that in order to stabilize the labor force in Germany, we need 400,000 persons net immigration per year, in basically over the starting now. And when we look at the last 10 years, 400,000 is roughly what we had in the past 10 years, but that was mostly not controlled labor migration, but basically uncontrolled labor migration that has been driven by people seeking refugee in Germany. And that's something that we do not expect to regularly happen, or we do not hope to regularly happen in the future. So basically the focus must go towards basically managed or controlled labor migration. And that's something that Germany is not really good at. We identify several barriers to labor migration in Germany. One is the equivalence assessment for professions. So basically, if you want to come to Germany as a labor migrant, you have to prove that the qualification that you got somewhere else is equivalent to a qualification that you could get in Germany. And as we all know, the dual qualification system in Germany is very special, so it's almost impossible to show that you have an equivalent qualification. So one way to improve labor migration to Germany would be to relax this equivalence assessment. And the second way would be to basically not look at the qualifications, but only look at whether some firm in Germany offers you a job. And that's exactly what the Western Balkans regulation at the moment is doing. Basically, if you come from a country in the Western Balkans and you have a job offer from a German company, you can migrate to Germany. And when you look at the people that go through this route without basically an assessment of their qualifications, you see that those people remain in their jobs. They have really, really low unemployment rates. The qualification mix is actually quite good. So it's not only unqualified people coming to Germany, but the qualification mix is really, really good. And the people who come to Germany through this route have really good wage development. So they start in Germany with a good wage, and the wage increases over time. So our suggestion would be to extend this regulation to other countries, in particular in Eastern Europe and around the Mediterranean, to basically allow these people from this country to come to Germany if they get a job offer by a German firm. And those are two levers, and we can talk about other options in the Q&A. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much. And credit where credit's due. This is the team behind the report. And now I'm looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thank you so much, Niklas.
One question back to the last slide. So if you were assume though that the migration that you have so far, which you say actually in pure numbers, is that if that does continue, and there are good reasons to actually believe it won't decline, then that net migration you discussed would have to come on top of that.
No, so basically in the past 10 years, we have net migration of 400,000 people. But that's driven basically by the outliers from 2015, 2016, right? So in 2015, I think we had net migration of 900,000 people roughly. And so if you look at the reference scenario of the Institute for Employment Research, they expect 100,000. I think the statistical office expects in the reference scenario roughly 200,000 net migration. And I think the 200,000 without further changes to the legal environment is what's realistic. And that's also what we've seen. Basically, I think 100,000 is what we've seen between 2000 and 2010. And I think what is important to have in mind is also in the past 10 years, we have seen a lot of migration from the European Union, a lot of net migration from the European Union. But the other countries, the other labor markets in the European Union face the same problems as Germany. So we have demographic aging all over Europe, maybe a bit less in France, but basically all the other countries have demographic aging. So that's not really a realistic option for the future to have more migration from within Europe towards Germany, because that just exacerbates the problems in the other countries. So it's really labor migration from third countries that have higher population growth rates, that have younger populations, and potentially don't have the jobs for the young population, right? I mean, that's also something that we should keep in mind, that these are often countries with relatively high youth unemployment rates. So actually it's maybe not such a bad option to migrate to Germany or to Europe.
Okay, thanks. Just a qualifier. And of course, I should first say thank you, Nicholas, for the really, really interesting presentation, which of course only captures a small part of the report, which is very detailed, as one would expect from the Sachverständigenrat. Thank you, Mar, also for the very kind introduction. And I guess you will join us in the Q&A. Look, what can I bring to the table? Obviously, I think no one knows the German economy better than the German Council for the German economy. So I don't think I will challenge you there in a way. But let me maybe present the picture as I see it, as we see it, in a global context, and also, of course, coming to Europe. I mean, first of all, I think what is fascinating, and what is already I think in partly addressed by your presentation, is that we are now moving really in a world of supply side. You know, for a decade, being in the market, since Mar mentioned, you know, I joined the financial market in 2007, which tells you something about my ability to foresee, you know, because we would have joined a financial institution at the beginning of one of the largest financial crises, in history. But you know, with that aside, we were very much used to think of the economy as, you know, the supply side was pretty steady. You know, there was a, technology, you could always argue whether there was a productivity increase or decreases. There was obviously demographics in the background. But for 30 years or so, the global economy was really running into increased efficiency, in particular when it came to goods production, right? There was increased outsourcing, more and more trade, what we typically capture as globalization. That brought a lot of benefits, not only welfare in emerging markets, but also for us in the West in particular, continuous really moderation of goods inflation. And, political change, the pandemic, all these things together now brought very, very substantial change, which the way we looked at economy from the demand side prism, thinking of what do central banks do, your little bit of an output gap, positive output gap, negative output gap, inflation would go a bit up, interest rates would go a bit higher, the cyclical thinking, that was really, at least in markets, the bread and butter of analyzing economies is very much challenged now. And, this is now a time where we have to think of a variety of structural challenges, and they will really determine, I think, where we're going. In addition to thinking about central banks, etc. Now, the The energy part is, I think, only one part, and it's a particular European part, because obviously Europe has now the additional problem of essentially being cut off Russian gas, and that will imply a permanent. It looks at least permanent for quite some time until we fully have transitioned to renewable energies, of a supply side shock in terms of trade shock, where we will have more expensive energy. And that, of course, creates some fears of deindustrialization. But in general, it means permanently higher energy prices. What does it mean, for example, for potential growth? It's a very important implication. Maybe we can later discuss it. But is Germany now, or in the future 5 years at least, at the same potential growth rate as it was in the last 10 years? If not, if it is lower, it actually has implications, for example, for the ECB, how far maybe demand has to be reduced in order to bring demand supply back into equilibrium. If we believe that this is not a pure supply shock that has been driving inflation, I think we already at a point where we realize that this is it is not. It also then puts us in a world where we go from what we call in financial markets the Goldilocks, where essentially the absence of inflation allowed us to stimulate growth, or even at some points only financial asset growth, without costs. And I believe it to some extent, actually, fiscal policymakers, which are politicians who are in electoral cycles, they are still in that world where they were told by academics, and rightly so, that they could actually spend more, because in a world of permanently low interest rates, high sovereign debt or high public debt was no longer that important. They're in that world. They used that during the pandemic very successfully. We had a deep recession, but they weren't very long. And particularly in the US, for the first time, really, they were very, very aggressive on the fiscal side. But they're now in a world of trade-offs where, and Nicholas, you alluded to this, where suddenly, it is no longer the case that the monetary policy, as it was in Europe, begs fiscal policies to support them to stimulate demand, to bring inflation up. It's now the other way around, where the ECB says you have to be tailored, targeted, and temporary, because some of that big bazooka fiscal spending, in particular in Germany, may not allow us actually to bring down inflation sufficiently. And I think it's quite interesting. One of the big German newspapers and colleagues just an hour ago forwarded me this article where there are now doubts whether Germany may go into recession at all. The fourth quarter may still be quite good. And there are some people with a bit of luck. I get to that in a moment. China reopening, maybe we escape recession. And then the question is that actually the target? Is that meant by solidarity? Because solidarity is often a very wide formula that can be applied, solidarity within Europe, within income groups, within households versus industry. So, politicians love that because, you can do all kinds of things under the umbrella of solidarity. And the question is actually avoiding a recession at all costs at this time really something that is beneficial, at least even for the medium to not even the long term, just the medium term, in terms of not helping actually the ECB with its inflation target? I think that's something to discuss more as well. Another point is we are discussing right now the policy in the German and particularly also in the European context. And that makes a lot of sense. And, you both alluded to, and Mar, you did as well in the introduction, about the issue of solidarity in Europe, how, we quickly saw a pattern that to some extent we saw during the pandemic where there was solidarity, but there was also in the emergency, countries tried to procure the materials they needed to keep their population safe. And that is honestly, that's the instinct of any politicians, because they get voted, by their voting population within their national boundaries. And now we have a situation also where obviously, given the differences in the energy supply, not all countries necessarily see eye to eye when it comes to how to deal with the current supply side crisis from Russian gas. But let's take this to another level and think the West, or even beyond the West, just the entire world, we are now entering, in particular with the US, seemingly into a competitive environment when it comes to industrial policy. Now, maybe we talk about climate policy a bit later, Mar, that's obviously your expertise, but the US basically has decided to tackle the carbon, or in general, the climate issue, not through carbon prices, which EU, at least to some extent, is doing. And that means they're doing it now through subsidies. And, the Inflation Reduction Act is nothing but a huge subsidy, which will, channel money into, the new innovative sectors, or at least, sectors with the technologies that are needed. But it's essentially, and that's already the talk of the town, right? We see this by the German industry on the European level, which essentially incentivizes industries to leave. And so, Nicholas, there will be now industries that not only see the higher energy price, but on top of the high energy price in Europe, they're seeing a big subsidy that is being handed to them potentially by the US. And they're saying, look, I mean, that's too good to be true. I have to leave if you don't do the same. Now, most of my economic upbringing in a way tells me that typically these things don't lead to efficient outcomes, right? If you have two regions throwing subsidies at each other, and frankly, obviously, China has been in that business in a way for a long time in a very different economic model. But again, I think that is to discuss, because Europe is not doing this only within itself, in the sense of having to think about the implications of German support for corporates, what it does to the corporates in Spain and Italy, but we have to think as Europe as a whole. The biggest competition, at least global investors look at this way, they think of Europe versus US and versus other parts. And I think that is it's a big challenge. And as I said, it comes at a point when I believe this is really a very, very different world now, where we are in a situation where structural change of supply chains beyond energy are very important. And let me mention one, because that gives me a transition to China. One is chips. In a certain way, energy is still relatively primitive. I mean, we need energy for everything. So even chips only run with electricity. But, as you flagged, Nicholas, Germany was quite successful in quickly moving some of the, getting floating LNG terminals, rerouting some of the LNG gas that went to Asia, to Europe. It's a matter of price, it's a matter of negotiation, and, a bit of luck that China actually wasn't demanding much. And I get to that in a moment. But, another commodity of the 21st century is our chips. And, they were disrupted. The supply was disrupted during the pandemic, which was already a painful experience for a lot of the German industries that were reliant on it, in particular the car industry. And if we go to electric cars, there'll be more demand for it, 5G networks, etc. There's only one way to go for chips, and that is really up. And we are very, very reliant. Without going into too much of the detail, but we are extremely reliant on a few factories in Asia, in particular, frankly, in Taiwan, and maybe another one in South Korea. There's now also competition on that front to lure chip production into US and as well as Europe. It will take a long time to build this, probably longer even than rerouting some LNG gas. But it's something that is that will determine many things going forward, whether industries, certain high-tech industries can remain in Europe, and also, the question of the input prices for industries. And then a last point, and then we should really go into the discussion, and that is more cyclical now, but is of course related to chips and technology. Is it now looks as if China may reopen more quickly. The last week's developments in China do point to that. It's probably a mixture of, the pressure from the street, but also the fact that the Chinese economy has been continuing to slow, probably beyond comfort for the regime. And for Europe in particular, there could be a very double-edged sword from a cyclical perspective, because on the one hand, I think that European industries, particularly Germany, would love that if their one of their main export markets actually is growing again and will demand more. This is why some believe we may escape a recession. But at the same time, and I don't know, Nicholas, whether you looked into this, but the reason why the energy situation at the moment looks relatively good in Europe is the mild climate, but it's also the fact that there were a lot of tankers suddenly in front of the Spanish coast, and in part those were tankers rerouted from Asia. Fact is that China contracted a lot of LNG, which it didn't use. You can look at the line of LNG used by China went up like this, and then suddenly the last year it went like this, meaning because of their low activity in the economy, they didn't use it. And if they come back, they probably will use that, and that could mean that some of those of that energy, natural gas, but also for transportation, oil prices will go back up, and so that could be, on the one hand, more demand for Europe from China, but also more pressure again on the energy. I think I leave it here.
But thank you so much for bringing up this broader perspective on the challenge and how domestic policies, industrial policy can interact with the recovery in China. I do wonder how to separate the chicken or egg question. So China obviously is slowing down. In part, it could be the price signal that's also affecting the demand in China. So the energy price affects China, but at the same time, China is slowing down for many other reasons, like no COVID policy. So it might take some time to figure out how much each of these different forces is affecting the demand in China. But I totally agree that it will be a big factor on energy prices going forward. So we have some questions here. I will, it sounds like they are all from the same person. So Thomas Willarek had several questions. So Thomas is asking about inflation. And he's asking that it seems, so I will read it, Niklas. It says your analysis shows that euro area core CPI inflation is driven by external demand and supply shocks, not domestic demand. But the ECB can only influence inflation due to domestic demand. So why do forecast a further tightening in ECB monetary policy given your analysis? So.
Yeah, I can directly answer to that. So it's true that if you look at this decomposition, it's roughly, I would say, 2/3 is due to energy supply and global demand. But nonetheless, I mean, it doesn't really. So first of all, the ECB can basically influence overall demand, mostly domestic demand, but through its interest rate decisions, it also affects the exchange rate, right? And through that affects how much of global demand is really materializing into demand for European products. So that's one channel through which it can influence demand. And on the other hand, it's not really. I think it's not really crucial whether it's domestic demand or global demand that's overshooting. What matters is that there's a disconnect between aggregate demand for goods in Europe and aggregate supply of goods from Europe, right? And somehow this has to be balanced, and that's basically the role of the central bank, in particular in Europe, where it doesn't have a dual mandate, right? Its main mandate is to ensure price stability. So it has to bring demand for European goods in balance with supply of European goods, and I guess that's the main reason why we would argue that further tightening is necessary. I wouldn't say that I would say that the ECB overall is on a good course at the moment, right? So I mean they started tightening in summer, and the monetary policy decisions were decisive. The 75 basis points hikes were unprecedented. There's one situation in which the ECB hiked by 75 basis points, and that was at its very first meeting in 1999. So this basically shows that the ECB also realizes that it's in a yeah, it's in a really tough position. And what Christian mentioned, that fiscal policy at the moment is really working against monetary policy, in particular because it's not so targeted, but because it's relatively broad-based. I think that's a big challenge for the ECB, and that's also one reason why we argue that, well, you cannot bring out all these support measures and do all of that debt financed. And in Germany, I mean, it is debt financed, right? So I think introducing somehow a financing through taxes is not only good in order to increase the precision of the packages, but also to limit its impact for its fiscal impact, so its impact for the debt levels and its inflationary impact. And as a last point, it's also, I think, a signal to the other European countries that Germany is not taking advantage of its relatively good fiscal position to bring subsidies to households and to industries that other countries might not be able to hand out, right? So I think there are 4 points to that. So let me stop here.
Yeah, going back to the context, I imagine also the role of the Federal Reserve matters in what the ECB can and cannot do. So we've seen also a lot of movement there. I don't know if you have some thoughts on how what the Federal Reserve does might constrain what the ECB can do on that end, or whether it should affect what the ECB can do on its end.
I mean, obviously the external environment affects what the ECB is doing, but I mean, the ECB is still independent. It has to some extent react to the Federal Reserve, because the interest rate differential is affecting exchange rates and is affecting import prices. But I think probably Christian has
more thoughts
than I have on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously the Fed affects everyone, but I would think that from all the central banks, it probably the ECB is one, being the very, very large economic area, is probably less affected. And the euro actually is not driven as some emerging market currency that really has to continuously watch the interest rate differential, which means carry trades, and when they withdraw, the currency immediately moves. Frankly, I think there is the euro has been weakening for different reasons. I don't think the ECB is that dependent on. For example, if the Fed was to stop in February, March, which we expect in March, if the ECB needs to continue, it probably could do so, and it wouldn't necessarily mean that from then on the euro would just appreciate because it continues to hike when the Fed stops. So. There's a connectivity between all the bond markets in the world, the core bond markets, and obviously also through carry trades, a short interest rate differential. But I think the ECB can act relatively independently, frankly.
Wonderful. So we have many questions and we are right on time. So maybe we can focus on some of the energy. There are several questions on energy prices and the dependence on Russia. Is the dependence on Russia gone, or are we gonna go back onto the Russian ship as soon as it's available? This is some of the questions that people are asking. They are also asking if the cheap energy prices are gone, and whether that means that we will see continued inflation. Maybe here I would say that to me it would be good news if cheap energy does not come back. We need to use less energy, and the inflationary pressure might not be sustained, because if energy prices go up, that will create a lot of inflationary pressure. But once they stay up, it's not additional inflationary pressure. So the prices have already reflected those high energy prices. Obviously, they are now extremely high. But I would be in some ways disappointed if we don't learn from this crisis that energy is more expensive than we think. So what do you think, Nicholas and Christian, on that note? And then we might have to wrap it up as we are a bit over time.
Yeah, so on the medium-term outlook, I mean, we do not do our own energy price modeling, but I think, so in our outlook, we said, so for the next 2 or 3 years, we don't expect Russian gas to come back. no matter what. So no matter how the war in Ukraine goes, we do not expect Europe to again purchase Russian gas. Even if there would be regime change, and I think that's, I mean, something that I have no idea about whether that's realistic or not, or whatever. We don't expect Europe to purchase Russian gas. I think for the foreseeable future, that's gone. And I think that's also reflected in market expectations, right? If you look at the futures prices, medium-term outlook is that prices will be 2 to 3 times as high as before the war. So, or as in 2015 to 2019, which we always use as a reference period. And with 2 to 3 times higher energy prices, as I said, some products, some companies will not be competitive. In particular, if you look, for example, at ammonia production, which is super natural gas intensive, I mean, except for what you need to really have coupled products, right? Like I don't know, CO2 for beverages. I guess most of ammonia will be imported from the United States, where natural gas is much cheaper, and I think that will stay that way as long as we do not have increased liquefaction capacities in the United States. And even then, I think we won't have so much liquefaction capacity that the price between Europe and US is the same. So that will be a competitive pressure for Germany, but even, I mean, only for some parts of the economy and some companies for which energy is really important. Because, I mean, also before the war, energy prices in Europe were quite high. And in Germany, we have a large industrial manufacturing sector that is competitive because it produces in some parts niche products, in other parts it just has good engineering, right? And I think that's the competitive advantage of the German industry, and that's not gone with the war.
Awesome, Christian.
So
if you want to have some last
yeah.
words, Christian.
Look, very quick on one. I think Nicholas is fully right. Look, I mean, to believe that we go back to the pre-war energy prices in Europe, I think that's, you know, who knows, but that is, you know, as an investor, I would not make that bet. In general, I think it's permanent, very safe to assume that we stay at elevated prices. Now, how elevated maybe is a bit of a question, but it will be certainly not back to the, you know, Russian gas pipeline gas prices. One. Second, I think something interesting, which we won't be able to answer right here, but it is the transition towards, you know, green energy. In principle, right, at the end of that, there could be a situation where actually energy becomes cheaper because the wind in the air is for free. However, and that is something, Nicholas, I mean, as I said, it probably would take too long, but you said something very interesting when you talked about the energy outlook. I think you said the word if we manage to do this transition then. And frankly, there, I get this question a lot from clients, and I'm not an expert, but there are many, I'm not saying studies, actually, just like people claiming that it's actually impossible for Germany to build enough wind turbines because the amount of turbines per day that would have to be built and what has been built in the past, it's not possible. I mean, that's something I think that creates a lot of fear then and uncertainty whether, you know, that if is realistic in terms of making that transition. I think it's a key question because that will determine whether we have the positive outcome where suddenly, you know, with what, 5 years from now or so, maybe Europe can claim that energy crisis was a positive shock that catapulted, you know, Europe to a, you know, higher productivity, higher tech region, you know, where we may be leading in technologies that others ultimately have to move over to, you know, carbon, you know, low carbon industrial production, for example. Or whether we basically will deindustrialize because, you know, we didn't manage to produce enough energy. I think the key question, I don't know, maybe you have more of it in the report. But
yeah,
I think
that's a very important question. I initially thought that the crisis would catapult these energy investments, but I've seen a lot of cold feet in many of the policy making that we have seen, many of the more reactive let's try to fix this quickly. And that kind of environment might not help in this kind of, let's think fresh, what do we need to do to get this really solved? So I see a lot of reactive policies that might not combine well with the need for a vision that goes beyond this kind of extreme event. Let's figure something out quickly. But we don't have time to answer that question. So thank you to everyone who could stick around a little bit longer. And thank you, obviously, first and foremost, to Nicholas and Christian for spending this afternoon with us, discussing the report, and also with your insights. Christian, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. And we look forward to seeing you in future events.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was very interesting. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Christian.